Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder three? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. It is February 3rd, 2018. Today we're going to be talking about the Laredo UFO Crash. Before we get to the Laredo crash, here are a few UFO reports that I've either heard from the relatives or from the person themselves. With me today in the studio is Joe Rogerio, a UFO and paranormal investigator. Now tell us, Joe, what was your sighting like?
The sighting was amazing. This was not like any other sighting I've ever encountered before. Actually, it was the most, like, far out of this world, you know. It took me a while to grasp, to find out what happened. And I wasn't alone. There was several witnesses around me.
Were they willing to talk about it, or did they not want to?
Well, this encounter was call it a CE1, but a multiple CE1. Close Encounter 1. This was a visual sighting with multiple lights in the sky, in the night sky. And I've tried to speak to one of the adults that was nearby me, and she no longer lives in Laredo, and I've been trying to track her, but all day long, I was working with her, and it was a work day, and I was where we were. It was in Camp Corpus Christi, and this is in Medina, Texas, and Bandera County, and it was somewhat like a retreat. And at the time, I was working for an organization who would send out messages, to the youth, to stay away from drugs and alcohol.
Trying to show them a better way of life.
Yes. And so I believe it was the second or third night that we're there. And while we were there, it was during the evening, and my supervisor, and she told me that, Joe, it's getting time to bedtime, get your kids, your group, and put them in the cabins and put them to sleep, and that's the end of it, And this lady was very strict, very, very strict. So as soon as she told me that, I took the kids to the cabins, and we did, the opposite. That's when I noticed that there were some lights overhead, and we were all just freaking out, and I was with about 5 children, young teenagers. So I had a toy radio, and so we were communicating during the night, during the day, when our stay there, and she just tells me, she just like gets on the radio, Joe, your lights are on, your kids are outside, where are you? I'm headed there right now. Why aren't your kids in bed, in their cabin, asleep? And I go, I couldn't talk, so, and I go, I'll call her Gracie. And I go, Gracie, you get over here. And she just comes in this little Astro van, and she parks, and she storms out of this, gets out of the vehicle, and he's already pointing and so and so. And I go, Gracie, do you remember what I was telling you about these sightings I've had these past, couple of days prior? And I go, look up. And she looks up, and she gets startled. I remember her reaction. And she's just like mesmerized, and they were calling her, what's going on down there? What's up? What's going on? And she gets the radio, and and she replies, strange lights, don't know what it is. I mean, she just totally changed, from one type of person to another. And I looked at her and I go, you see, Gracie, now do you believe me? Now do you believe me? And she goes, yes, Joseph. She goes, yes.
It's amazing how something like that will change a person's entire life.
Yes, it was an incredible sighting. It was multiple lights flying all over crossing the horizon. Some going slow, some going fast, different colors. Did not see any surfaces of the vehicles. These were just lights. I believe they could be part of the vehicle that was flying around, but I didn't see any type of vehicle.
One of the favorite ways of describing something as far as the size of a light goes, if you were to hold an aspirin tablet at arm's length, approximately how big would it be compared to that?
An aspirin, I would say, I'd say just a little bit smaller.
So in other words, that was a pretty good sized light.
Oh, yes.
No way it could have been a star.
No. This was, I've worked for American Airlines for about 5 years, and I've worked a ramp agent. I taxied out aircraft. I've waited for aircraft to touch and go, to land, and I've observed aircraft which are like 20 miles away, and I've seen them with their lights on, which are navigational lights, and you can still see them, but it appears in the sky that it's stationary, but actually they're in descent, they're in approach, and it takes a while. You think it's going to land? Nope. So you're sitting out there for about 10 minutes, and it's the same light. It's just, so this was not
not aircraft,
not a conventional aircraft, nothing, or that made noises like one.
Was there any sound, or was it pretty much quiet?
No sound. Absolutely nothing.
That's amazing. At night, when a jet is passing 10,000 feet up in the sky, you can hear its engines.
Correct.
And a lot of people are just assuming, oh, that's an airplane. And they always seem to forget airplanes make noise.
Yes. I know back in my dad's survival book when he was in the Army, when he enlisted, when he was like 17 years old back in the 40s, he had this survival book, and it said that if you have a mirror and you see an aircraft or a jet flying by overhead, that you don't try to signal the jet, you signal the
ahead of it.
Yeah, behind it, right?
Behind?
No, or ahead. There we go. The head, and so yeah, it's. I've heard noises and booms before, sonic booms, but this encounter was just incredible.
About how long were the lights in the air that you can guesstimate?
Well, the occurrence, we arrived. I was in the hill country at the time. This was June 3rd of 1999, and I was around Brackenridge or somewhere around there. So we were gonna meet I was gonna meet up with my coworkers and boss in Medina. So it was a short drive away. So I was already in the area. So I got to to Camp Corpus Christi about a day and a half before my crew arrived.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a beautiful place. And if you want to kind of have like an image of how it looks like, if you've ever seen any of the Friday the 13th movies, you know, I'm not kidding you. That's how it looked like, you know, and it was so. It had an eerie touch to it because at that time there was a murderer on the loose, and on that specific weekend, he was around the Texas area. It was the what's his name? The Richard something. The train.
Yes.
The guy on the train. I forgot his name.
I can't remember
Yes.
either, and we were actually actively looking for the guy, but I can't remember his name.
Well, he passed by. He started off somewhere and he went down south, and so yeah, I kind of had like a feeling that he's coming nearby. You know that he was. Well, that happened when I was waiting in the river, and so. But it's a beautiful location. So this sighting occurred. There was multiple sightings. Not as an aircraft, but at different events, different times, different dates.
Were the lights, you said they were different colors. Could you,
Yes.
red, green, yellow?
We had yellow, there was red, there was blue.
Were they pulsing or steady?
They were both.
Okay.
Some were blinking. One was pulsating. It was a red light that I remember seeing it from far away in the horizon, and it shot like a jet, you know, going about 800 miles an hour, at 1,000 feet, you know, up in the air, and it cleared the whole, you know, from left to right in about 3 seconds, and because I saw the blink of a light, and the next time I saw it, it was right over me, and the next time I saw it, it was already, it was gone. So it was incredible.
Way too fast for any commercial
Yes,
jet.
it was just incredible. The other ones were, I remember there was a cloud cover, and right above the ceiling, it's like they knew what they were doing. They came so right above the ceiling. You know, they didn't break that. They didn't break the ceiling and made themselves visible, but the lights were right just above the ceiling. So it was still, you know, it's just crazy. It was crazy. Like I said, several were pulsating, and the other ones were steady.
Once you'd had the sightings and you'd convinced your supervisor that you weren't crazy, what did you do next?
Well, I was just I didn't know what was going on. I mean, I was just like, I was so freaked out. I was so just, you know, like that saying, you know, I was standing beside myself, and I was thinking about it all night long. The next morning, during breakfast, I hear the story of this little boy said that he saw someone out in the field carrying a deer. And at that area, in this Camp Corpus Christi, there's some wildlife there. They look like access deer. I don't know what kind of.
In and around Medina, you can find just about any kind of deer because there are a couple of exotic animal compounds there. You'll run into ostrich, emus, all kinds of deer from all over the planet. So it's a pretty mixed up place. So this creature was carrying one of these deer.
Yeah, there was a humanoid figure, you know, bipedal, walking, and according to this little boy, and he heard what we were talking about, and then he just mentions this, and he mentions that it was headed towards a light. Now, where I was sleeping, and my bunk, well, where my bed was close to the door, and I kept on looking out the window. There was a light out in the field,
Mm-hmm.
and this particular light was there. Let's say, this occurred on the 7th.
Mm-hmm.
It was there on the 5th. It was there on the 5th, on the 4th and
Mm-hmm.
the 5th.
Just so people will know,
Yes.
I'm sure one or two people are going to already be saying, "Oh, it was just somebody's yard light." There aren't a whole lot of houses in this area,
Nope.
and there are some very tall hills
Yes.
on all sides.
Yes.
You're not going to be seeing somebody's yard light in this area.
No. A yard light will probably be, of course, like 8-10 feet up in the air.
Mm-hmm.
The farther you go, it's going to look like if it's on eye level to the ground. No, this was the background was below the light was you can see the sky,
Mm-hmm.
and above the light. But one of the highlights of the sightings occurred on the 4th, the 5th,
Mm-hmm.
and the 7th. On the 4th was the first sighting that I had. I was, getting my stuff down, and I just parked, and I was walking through the driveway of this facility, and admiring the whole place.
Mm-hmm.
It's just beautiful,
Oh, yes. Medina is a fantastic
Yes,
location.
and these trees were like huge, and and I was looking up, and I remember I saw this light, and I didn't think much of it, and so I kept on walking, and I saw it again, and when I stood still, I saw it moving very slowly,
Mm-hmm.
and I go, you know what? There's this military helicopter. That's the first thing that came to
Mm-hmm.
me. It's quiet.
Mm-hmm.
It's a military helicopter. Well, this thing was too low for it.
Mm-hmm.
So when I realized, you know what, it's probably a UFO. So I ran to my truck. I got my Sony camcorder,
Mm-hmm.
and I got to a clearing, and I followed this light that went towards, I would say, like 200 yards out in the distance, and it stayed stationary.
Any sound with that light?
No sound. Now, this was an orb.
Mm-hmm.
This was like the size of an aspirin if you were to put it out. That's how close it was.
I don't know who was the first one to come up with this aspirin idea, but I've heard it dozens of times on descriptions of lights in the sky, so that's what we go with.
Yeah, that's a real good, so you can get a better.
You gotta compare it to something.
Yes.
Getting back to the kid with the creature that he saw, or the being,
Mm-hmm.
was he able to give any kind of a description of it, or was it just a shape?
He said it was a dark shape, and he called it a man. He said that it was. Because I told him that this is a deer is, it's not the size of a dog, and I go, but a deer is like pretty big.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I can carry a deer, a full-grown deer. No, I can't. It's, maybe, but I was trying to give him this idea that, how can that be? But he said, no, it was a black figure that was walking across, and he had the deer in his arms.
Mm-hmm.
So when I saw that, when he said in his arms, that meant the average sized deer, more or less, on the arms, you're talking about this, then this body was,
Mm-hmm.
it was a large frame. And it just was walking, just like nothing towards the light.
He was the only one that saw it. None of his
no
companions?
one else. No one else. And, I believe him because
Yes.
he heard our story, but we didn't talk about any aliens. We didn't talk about nobody walking or anything like that. We didn't talk about even the deers. We're just talking about lights.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden he just pops up with like, hey, I saw this person, someone, a black figure, was carrying a deer. Like, that's just like, So
once you all had your sightings, what was your next course of action?
Well, going back to one of the sightings that I did not mention on the report, and I've only mentioned it maybe about, I guess, several times throughout the years since 1999, and I'll tell you here in the studio. While this was on the June the 5th, I believe. June the 5th, the same light occurred the next day all over me. And it started to move again. And I had my camera. So I was like, I can't say filming because I was recording, not taping. Well, I can say a tape because it was a high tape, but so I was recording, and while it was moving, I just see this convoy of vehicles come up, beep 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 beep, and they saw me. That was like in the middle of the, hey Joe, get your butt over here and help us unload, like. But, so what, or blah, blah, blah. And this is like carrying a conversation about 100 feet away. So I was like, okay, I'm working. So I had to put everything away, and I saw the slide, and it just kept on moving. Well, during the night, under a canopy, with the lights were on, we took out food for the kids to eat, dinner. I think they were like sandwiches or something. Under this pavilion, the kids were under the pavilion. I was standing there, and this light, the original one that was over me, well, it stayed more or less in the same area. And in the distance, beyond the pavilion, was a open area. And I had my video camera, so I was recording the light, and I go, look, guys. I was telling the kids, like, you see that? That's a UFO. And he goes, wow, really? And the kids, and well, the next thing that happens, this light dims down, disappears, and about instantaneously, I believe, like in hyperspace, like towards the end of the field, and it reappeared. So this one turned off, and then one turned on over there.
That is incredible.
Yes, and then that there's reports about this. Well, going back what you asked me after all of this happened, I had a feeling, I was like a virgin, I was like, okay, I didn't want to get these, like MIBs, and you talk about something that's taboo, and you're gonna get visited, and so I kept it hush hush for a bit, and it took me only 3 months after that I reported it to New Fork, the
North American UFO Reporting Center.
Yes. And
they've been doing the Air Force's job since Project Blue Book was brought to a halt.
And and you know what? On the actual, I submitted the report, and they deleted my name.
They'll do that sometimes.
But during the body, I addressed it as, hello, my name is Joe Rogerio. So they didn't delete that part. And I said, you know what? Anybody want to get in touch with me about getting talking? And I put my email address. Nothing. I didn't get anything. And I was kind of like creeped out during the years that went by. So I kept this tape in a drawer, and I left it there for years.
You still have the tape?
I do. But along the way, when I wanted to review it,
Mm-hmm.
some peculiar things happened during the times when I was reviewing the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it I accidentally erased,
Oof.
recorded over. Part of it was like black.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, you know what? Hey, no. And I go, what's no. I go, no. Like, how was like I couldn't find words, or
Mm-hmm.
there was still some more. Footage, and that one gets accidentally erased also. So what's left is when the light is in the field,
Mm-hmm.
the children are looking at it, and I go, look, that's a UFO, and like they told me, and so I had the camera, the video camera on a tripod, and the kids were around me, and so we started talking to this thing, and we were trying to communicate with telepathy, through telepathy.
Mm-hmm.
I go, you know what? Let's try to see maybe if we can move to the right or to the left.
That's very similar to what John Keel did, except he used a light to try to blink to flying saucers.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So what we did,
It's not that strange.
No. Well, we put it to the test,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll see the reaction of the kids. Okay, let's do it. And there wasn't even the cooks
Mm-hmm.
saw what was going on, because the cooks, what's going on out there?
Mm-hmm.
They came out in their aprons, and they got scared. They started praying, So one of them, just stands next to me, and so we decided to, okay, let's concentrate if we can move to the right or to the left, and we started doing that, and there was a pause, a silence, and then all of a sudden you just hear the kids, oh my God, and it happened, and what one girl actually, she got scared, she ran away.
Yikes.
I mean, she ran towards the adults, and
Anytime you're dealing with an unknown, if you're not psychologically prepared for just about anything, it can have unexpected results.
yeah, I believe so too.
I remember when a house around the corner from our house here caught fire, and no longer being a firefighter, I no longer had to respond to the fire, and the fire truck was already in the neighborhood. The reaction of the people in the neighborhood was unexpected. People were running around in circles. They were crying. They were screaming. And I kept wondering, they don't even know the people that lived in that house. But the emotional reaction was just so unexpected. It was unbelievable. So I can understand some small kid seeing a UFO and having heard the stories, I can see how they could be somewhat upset.
Yes.
They might become the next Travis Walton for all they know, and that could be a very traumatic experience.
I agree.
Have you been back to the area there in Medina since then?
I did. I passed by. I drove by when I was driving around the hill country. It was during the daytime, and so it was a little bit different. I spoke to and I'm talking about, this was back in this was back in
Recently.
well, no. Remember, this occurred in 1999.
To me, 1999 isn't that far back. But
So, I believe it was like
early 2000s.
2001.
Okay.
I go back and I'm looking around, and just remembering everything. The second time I went by,
Mm-hmm.
I took a detour. I went to. I wanted to buy this I found this 1973 Buick Electra 225 on Craigslist, and it was in early Texas. So I get there by bus.
Mm-hmm.
Then driving back to Laredo, I was taking all these farm roads and these county roads, and I was going to pass through Medina.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I didn't want to.
Mm-hmm. I can understand.
It was kind of eerie. It's just weird. It's just, it was kind of eerie.
Mm-hmm.
And like, you know what? And, yeah, I took another route.
Do you have any, shall we say, words of advice for anybody else who might have a similar occurrence?
Well, as a paranormal investigator, my main job is to always, keep a cool head no matter, regardless of what happens. And also to be the devil's advocate.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be, one thing that I do stress is that you have to be honest with yourself. Don't fool yourself. Don't lie to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Be honest with yourself. Even though you do not believe in a certain type of cryptids or UFOs or ghosts,
alien
or
entities visiting our planet.
Just remember or understand what you saw or what you're seeing,
mm-hmm.
and record it, repeat it exactly the way it was.
All
exactly, right. Because once you do that,
mm-hmm.
you're being honest with yourself. Because once you just go off like just a couple of centimeters, that's just going to turn into something else, and then it just, it'll have a different ending on its own, on what originally
mm-hmm.
what occurred.
A lot of people will allow themselves to be talked into not believing what their own eyes had shown them, which is a bad thing, but that's human nature, I guess.
Yes.
Well, I appreciate your coming on the show with us today. Anything else you'd like to say before we call this interview quits?
Well, I'd like to thank you for bringing me on your show. I had a great time, and I'm here to share other stories that I've encountered, other sightings, if you like, and part of what we do with Laredo Paranormal Research Society. But thank you again. Thank you for the hospitality.
You bet.
It's been a wonderful experience.
This has been Joe Rogerio in the studio with us today. Don't go away. We'll be right back with a few more stories from in and around Laredo, and then we will be talking about the Laredo UFO crash from 1948. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Truck. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. And welcome back to the show. That was Joe with us earlier telling about his UFO experience out in Medina, Texas. The next story comes from a person that I know who was living in Monterrey, Mexico back in the late 70s and early 80s. She'd grown up in Nuevo Laredo and had an urge to drive home each weekend. It's about 140 miles each way, but back then the highway was in bad shape, and it curved in and out of the mountains. At that time, it was not so lovingly called the Highway of Death. Her husband was in a veterinarian school, and he had to go to school in the morning, and so they had to be back home so he could get up Monday morning. In order to make the drive, they would set out Sunday afternoon, and they were usually home by dark. Well, life happens, and one Sunday they didn't get going until sometime around midnight. There was a reason the highway was called the Highway of Death. All the trucks driving to Laredo had to use this road. Some of these truck drivers were working way too many hours, and some probably shouldn't have been doing truck driving as a living. Maybe their forte should have been sweeping the streets. Some considered the posted speed limit as being only a suggestion. Well, the family piled into their car and they got going south. With luck, they might be home by 4 in the morning. The drive was going okay, and they were making good time up until they got to the base of the Sierra Madre Oriental mountain range. This was the same area where in 1948 a flying saucer had crashed. As they came to the mountain range, their car suddenly died. The lights went out, the motor stopped, and the family was stuck on the side of the highway. As they sat there trying to get the dead vehicle to start, somebody noticed that there were a lot of stalled cars and trucks. There was a moon out, and it was giving enough light to see the shapes of these cars and trucks, all dead on the road. Well, suddenly, the car was illuminated from above by a blinding light. It lit the interior with a ghastly brilliance. Everyone tried to get what was hoped to be a safe location, squatting down under the dashboard or on the floor of the back seat. Then, thinking the best bet was to get out of the car, the family jumped out and made for the hopeful safety of the brush on the side of the roadway. From this position, they could see the light was coming from the bottom of a huge saucer-shaped craft that was hovering above their car. After a few minutes, the craft began to move, following the roadway with its light, as if it was looking for something or someone. The light blinked out just as suddenly as it had come on. The craft shot away into the distance with unbelievable speed. 1 second it was there, and the next it was on the horizon. It vanished from view. As soon as the saucer was out of sight, the lights came back on all the vehicles. The engine fired right up as if there had been nothing wrong with it. They got going back to Monterey with only questions floating in their minds. The aftermath of all the bad press and negative comments had an effect on them. No one was willing to talk about what they all knew had happened. You see, only crazy people see UFOs. You had to be nuts to see a flying saucer. It took years before she or any of the family were willing to talk about what had happened back in the 1980s on that desolate stretch of Highway 85. The last time my wife and I drove to Monterey, Mexico, someone had built a huge shrine. It was in the middle of the highway. The shrine was to Santa Muerte, the patron saint of drug smugglers and criminals. The shrine was very close to where that family had had their incident. This next story came to me from a coworker back when I still had a job. Now I have to work twice as hard just trying to relax. His dad was staying at Rancho Villa Juarez in Mexico, which is about 2-hour drive west from Laredo. This was about 15 to 20 years ago. This area had no towns of any significance, and it got very dark at night. As he was sitting in the living room, he noticed there were some lights out in the field. His first thought was there were poachers on his property. This was bad news because they would shoot anything, not worrying about size or whether the deer would reproduce or not. Well, the man grabbed his rifle and he jumped in his pickup, intent on sending these trespassers away. As he drew close to the lights, he saw they were a greenish color. The closer he got, he could now see that it was a triangular craft hovering just above the ground. The light was illuminating it from below. Just beneath the craft, and in the green light, was some kind of a humanoid-looking figure. The figure vanished into the craft, and then the flying triangle shot straight up into the air at a ridiculous speed. As it flew away, his dad said it didn't make a sound, it just left. Now here's a story I was given by Rick while selling some books at the Pan American courts. The incidents, there were a few, took place while he was with his dad. This was over several nights during the summer in the mid-60s. They would sit out in the backyard and just watch the night go by. This was back when TV was not the center of the family's attention. Lawn chairs could be found in everybody's backyard. As they sat there looking up at the stars, a shadow began to move into view. It wasn't so much visible as it blocked out the stars behind it. The objects didn't have any lights showing. There were 3 or 4 of them, and they passed over silently. The shape was more or less like a group of airplanes, but it wasn't very distinct. As the craft were moving through the sky, it looked as if webs of some unknown substance began to shoot out from the shadowy shapes. The webs were silky white in color, kind of translucent. The webs just hung there in the sky as the black shapes moved on. The webs seemed to disintegrate as they slowly drifted down towards the earth. They were gone before they got too low in the sky. Well, the witness was a bit scared by this, and he asked his dad what those things were. His dad said he had no idea, and he just sat there staring up at the sky. Now, this was strange, but then it happened again the following night. At about the same time as before, the stars were blocked from view by a group of shadowy craft that dispersed webs that slowly drifted down towards them. Then everything was gone. No evidence of any kind of vehicles or the webs. The third night was a repeat of the first 2. Nothing different, just the strange, weird, unknown shapes. Well, years went by, and the same man was now a grown person living on his own. He spotted some kind of a weird craft up in the sky in the middle of the afternoon. It changed shapes as he watched. One moment it was triangular, and the next it was a square, then it was round. After watching it for a few minutes, the strange craft slowly vanished. He wrote down all the details, but now he can't find the book that he wrote in. With time and maybe a little luck, he might find the book and give us the details on his weird sighting. Now, everyone has heard about the Roswell crash. Even people who don't look into UFOs and think the whole thing is just swamp gas know about the crash that took place back in July of 1947. Some folks will say it was a weather balloon. They believe the government wouldn't lie about such a thing. I discovered a lot of people had never heard about the saucer that crashed south of Laredo, exactly 1 year later. July 1948, a pair of fighters in a newly formed United States Air Force were pursuing an unknown object. I've read 2 different reports on where the chase began. One says the object was sighted in Washington State, July 7th at about 1:22 p.m. The unknown craft was spotted on radar, and it was traveling at about 2,000 miles an hour. At the time, we had nothing that could move that fast. A V-2 rocket could travel at 2,250 miles an hour, but this was as it fell back to Earth from the upper atmosphere. The United States was experimenting with V-2 rockets brought to our country at the end of World War II, but these missiles were not capable of traversing the country like the object caught on radar. The UFO had come south out of Canada. Canada didn't have any German rockets at the time. The unknown object flew across the country from Washington State to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque was just under 200 miles from Roswell. And if you draw a line from Albuquerque to Laredo, it passes almost right over Roswell Air Force Base. The craft began to slow down just slightly, and then it turned and flew into Texas. At some point, a pair of fighters began to pursue the UFO. The Air Force had F-80As in their inventory. These fighters were capable of flying at 500 miles an hour. That's not even close to what the UFO had been doing. And they did carry a healthy arsenal. Each jet was equipped with 6 50-caliber machine guns. A 50-caliber bullet travels at 2,850 feet per second. That is 1,943 miles per hour. Had the unknown craft continued at its original speed, even the machine gun bullets wouldn't have been able to catch up to it. Another story says the fighters were dispatched from San Antonio. Anyone familiar with San Antonio will know there are lots of military bases in the city. A pair of fighter jets could have been sent from Lackland Air Force Base and intercepted the UFO in a matter of minutes. Let's say the UFO was still traveling at 2,000 miles an hour as it approaches San Antonio. The fighter jets are traveling at 500 miles an hour. They would never be able to catch the craft, but they could have intercepted it going head-on or straight towards it as it flew towards them. By firing at the craft as it drew near, the UFO would actually have hit the bullets and not the other way around. The jet fighters would have to be sure to peel out or turn away from the approaching craft. Would our fighters have shot at some unknown craft? Well, the United States had just finished pounding the Axis powers. There were a lot of folks who had just gone through the whole shoot first and ask questions later. Many a firefight was won by being the first guy to get your rounds downrange. There is some question as to whether the fighters were able to hit the craft they were chasing or not. The short answer is, the craft did slow down, and it did eventually crash. However the situation transpired, the craft continued flying at a reduced speed, dropping down to around 90 miles an hour. The craft was described as being a circular craft with no wings or stabilizers. It reflected sunlight, telling the pilots it was metallic of some kind. As the flying saucer was approaching Laredo, it veered to the side, crossing into Mexico just west of town. If you look at a map of Texas, you'll notice the border between Texas and Mexico runs from the northwest to the southeast. The craft crossed into Mexico a few miles west of town. It crashed in Nuevo Leon, Mexico, about 30 miles from the border. If you look at the map once more, and you see where Laredo is, and then look for Zapata, named after Colonel Jose Antonio de Zapata, the crash site is west from Zapata and south from Laredo, just east from Highway 85. Today, if you're driving south to Monterey, just before you arrive at the toll booths, you will be in the approximate area of the crash. This was the area where the family had their UFO experience in the late 70s or 80s. Well, the Air Force fighters had stayed with the flying disc as it crossed the border and crashed. They radioed in they had a fallen angel, which is code speak for a crashed airplane or UFO. The closest military base was San Antonio. Laredo Army Airfield had closed in 1945 at the end of World War II. The base was being used by the city of Laredo as a municipal airfield. The military wanted men on the ground as soon as they could get there. It was a 190-mile drive from Lackland Air Base to the crash site. This wasn't anything like today. It wasn't until General Dwight Eisenhower became president that the United States began to develop the interstate highway system. I-35 was more like a state road. Most people traveling from San Antonio to Laredo would have gone by train. Well, troops were loaded into trucks and driven down to the border. If you've never ridden in the back of a military truck, it's nothing even close to a bus. I can only imagine what the guys in the back of these trucks were going through. This would take about 4 hours on a good day. Once they arrived in Laredo, the trucks drove over the bridge and into Mexico. The folks in Washington had called the folks in Mexico City and told them that an experimental aircraft had gone astray and crashed in Mexico, and the Air Force was just going to drive over and recover the plane. Mexico City agreed to this kind of thing all the time. The convoy crossed the border and headed south. Highway 85 leads to Monterrey, Nuevo León, Mexico. At one time, it was referred to as the Highway of Death because it runs through some very nasty mountains and was not very well built or maintained. Why do you suppose Mexico was willing to allow U.S. troops to enter their country and remove some unknown object? Wouldn't you expect the government of Mexico to say they would handle the removal and return the object to the U.S. authorities at the bridge? The president of Mexico was Miguel Alemán. The president of the United States was Harry Truman. Both of these men were members of the Freemasons. This made them closer to each other than to their own countrymen. Do you suppose this might have greased the wheels a bit, allowing our troops to enter a foreign country to take possession of this flying disc? Truman was the first United States president to visit Mexico. Alemán was the first Mexican president to visit the United States. In the 1930s, Colonel Twining was assigned to the Army Air Corps Technical Support in San Antonio, Texas. He would later become General Twining, Chief of Staff. Here's a little something about generals. A one-star general is called a brigadier general. A two-star general is a major general. 3 stars is a lieutenant general. See, lieutenant is higher than major. I know this is confusing, but so is a lot of military stuff. A 4-star general is called general. And Eisenhower was a 5-star general. We would have called him a general of the army. Now, is that confusing or what? So Major General Twining was in charge of Air Materials Command in 1948. This strangely named unit was responsible for foreign technology. Say you found a Russian jet parked in your backyard. The foreign technology folks would come, take the jet back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The technical guys would take it apart and study how it had been built. The same would hold true for a flying saucer. Long before Area 51 was built, all otherworldly aircraft went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. This was the home of the mysterious Hangar 18. Project Sign was created at Wright-Patterson, as well as Project Grudge, which was a joke, and Project Blue Book, which was not really worth the money they spent. Now back to the crash site in Mexico. The Air Force and Army personnel arrived at the crash site and set up a perimeter. The idea being to see how far the crash debris was spread and see to it no civilians wandered into the area and saw something that they shouldn't. The debris was scattered all over the place. The hillside where the craft had hit, as well as the entire valley next to it, were covered in what was described as looking like the foil from cigarette packages. This foil was far stronger than any tin foil, It couldn't be torn by hand, and it resisted bending. It was already after 6, and the sun was getting close to the horizon. There was a lot to do, and not much time to do it in. The main craft was about 90 feet across. It stood 28 feet high at its highest point. The edges were 5 feet high. Inside the craft looked to house 5 or 6 different levels. It was hard to say for certain because the crash had bent some of the main structure. After the crash, the saucer had burned for some time. It was still smoldering and very hot when our troops arrived. The command wanted photographs of the craft before it could be moved. A group of Navy photographers were sent from White Sands Missile Test Center to take photos of the craft as well as the surrounding area. A lot could be learned by examining the scene, but they didn't have the time for protracted investigation. The photos would be needed later on. The photo crew were packed into a small observation plane and flown 680 miles to the crash site. They had to stop and refuel and let the passengers stretch their legs. Once in the air over the crash site, the photographers took photos of the site from above, and they circled the site from every angle. The plane landed in a field that had been cleared of brush and turned into a hasty runway. Anyone and everyone at the scene had to be cleared by the military police. You had to show your ID, and you had to open any bags that you had with you. As you left, each person was searched for any material they should not have on them. The Air Force had learned a lot from Roswell. As the craft cooled enough to enter, the soldiers found an occupant. It was believed that this might be the pilot. It was sitting in what was thought to be a control seat. The body was 4 feet 6 inches tall. It looked as if it had been clothed in some kind of a metallic material that had mostly been burned away during the fire. The head was extremely large compared to the body. The arms were longer than they would have been on any human. Each hand had 4 fingers, which ended in hooks that kind of looked like claws, and there were no thumbs. The feet ended in stubs instead of toes. The unburned skin had a grayish tinge to it. There was no evidence of muscles in the extremities. The arms and legs were very skinny in proportion to the rest of the body. The enormous head had no ears or nose, but these might have been burned away during the fire. The eye sockets were empty. The openings were large, and they reached partway around the skull. The placement of the eyes, as well as their size, led the investigators to believe that the creature had 180-degree vision. The average human has 120-degree vision. Due to the large head and small body, the pilot became known as the Tomato Man. You can look him up on the computer. Just look for Laredo Tomato Man. The photos are all black and white. Up until the 1950s, color photography was a long process. You had to set the camera on a tripod. You would click the shutter. Then you had to change your lenses. More often than not, the camera would get bumped, causing the photos to come out of focus. Then you had to use 3 different filters during the shoot. In the 1960s, color photography became much more user-friendly. The photography team took more than 500 images. The photographers, along with their cameras and photos, were taken back to White Sands under guard. Once there, all their work was done under extreme security. The film was guarded at all times. Any time one of the team needed to work with any of the negatives, he was guarded by Marine Corps guards. The lab was under lockdown at all times, and none of the photographers had any duties for the entire time that they worked on the images. Back then, you had to keep the film out of the light. When it was time to develop, you worked in what was called a dark room. It was just what it sounds like. The room was totally dark. You had to work by feel. Then, once the film had been dipped in chemical bath and then rinsed, you could use a red light to work by. A black and white film was sensitive to blue or white light, but red light was safe. The exposed film was called a negative. You placed this in an enlarger that would send light through the negative and onto photo paper. Once the image was enlarged, the photo paper had to be washed and rinsed in chemicals and then dried. There were a lot of steps involved, and any one of them could ruin your photos. I am so glad we have digital cameras today. So the team of photographers were guarded, the film they used was guarded, and the lab they worked in was guarded. Once the prints had been made, they were whisked away to the guys making all the decisions. Well, one of the photographers managed to borrow a few of the photographs. Since the guards doing all the guarding were not allowed to actually enter the lab, he managed to make prints of 40 of the images. One of these was the Tomato Man that we can see today. The UFO crash near Laredo may have been what was being described as a crash site in the Sierra Madre Oriental mountain range in the 40s. A scientist named Luis Alvarez was sent there to examine the remains of a crashed saucer. The craft was about 100 feet across. The site was 25 miles west-southwest from Zapata County. This would place the crash site right where the Laredo crash had taken place. The name is what was confusing. Laredo UFO Crash didn't take place in Laredo, but then the Roswell crash didn't happen in Roswell either. The Roswell crash site was near Corona, New Mexico, which lies 130 miles northwest from the airbase. Let's face it, the Laredo crash was a lot closer to Laredo than the Roswell crash was to Roswell. A cargo transport plane landed in the cleared field near the crash site. Any debris small enough was loaded into the airplane for transport to an undisclosed location. It may have landed in San Antonio Air Force Base, or it could have gone on to Fort Worth. I would put my money on the final destination being Wright-Patterson Air Base in Dayton, Ohio. The infamous Hangar 18 is where things like UFOs wound up being stored, but not on the hangar floor, where anybody might see them. The story goes the hangar floor was removed. The saucer was lowered into a tunnel complex that runs the entire length and width of the airbase, and then the floor was put back in. There are dozens of stories about what goes on in and around under the airbase. The base was originally known as Wilbur Wright Field, and it was opened in May 22, 1917. After Air Corps Ferry Command was established in May 29, 1941, the command opened at Patterson Field, which was next door to Wright Field. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base came into being as the Air Force Technical Base on January 13, 1948, just 6 months after the Roswell crash. The Groom Lake Test Facility was established in April 1955 by the Central Intelligence Agency, where they wanted to test the U-2 spy plane. Soon thereafter, the place became known as Area 51. Back to the Laredo crash once more. The bulk of the craft was not going to fit inside any airplane. The troops on the ground had to get it up onto a truck. The Army did have several heavy-lift trucks they might have used. Remember, the disc was 90 feet across. This would have required a huge trailer. The United States military had just finished doing the impossible. They had built airplanes and tanks and ships at an unheard-of pace and to extreme sizes. Putting a flying saucer on a truck trailer should have been child's play. The truck would have to have pulled this huge load into Nuevo Laredo. I wonder what the folks living there thought as this spectacle went by. The streets in town would have been too narrow in some places. The Army and Air Force personnel would have had to have looked for alternative routes in order to get to the bridge into the United States. Bridge number 1, there was no number 2 yet, had a superstructure that stood upright on both sides of the expanse. It would have been too narrow for a 90-foot disc to use. What a lot of folks don't know is the river just upriver from the bridge isn't all that deep. Some places it's only about 1.5 feet. The military might have simply driven across the river bottom, or perhaps they used a pontoon bridge, which wouldn't have had any side rails to negotiate. However they did it, they got the craft onto our side of the river. From there, it had to be driven up to San Antonio, to one of the bases. Once more, I wonder what people thought as this cargo went crawling by. It would have been a long day getting this saucer the entire 140 miles back to their home base. The craft would have spanned the entire roadway. Traffic, if there was any, would have had to have been stopped and diverted so the truck could drive down the center of the road. Once again, the military was in the habit of doing the impossible. Once the craft was secured inside a hangar, the scientists could descend on it at their leisure. They could study the metal and see what it was made from. It turned out to be made from 2 different kinds of a crystalline structure. Some of the metal was soft enough to bend while still being tough. The other was rigid and gave the craft its shape. When the craft was understood a bit more, it was disassembled enough to ship it off to Wright-Patterson Air Base, where it may still be to this day. The only way we'll ever know is if somebody actually pulls the saucer out from its hiding place and shows it to the world. No photograph is going to suffice. It will have to be the whole saucer or nothing. September 15th, 1950, a Defense Department physicist, Robert Scharbacher, said the United States government had successfully recovered the remains of crashed, unidentified flying objects, and that they were not made on this earth. He also said the objects were classified 2 points higher than the secrecy of the H-bomb. 1980, he went on to say he had seen crash reports of flying discs while working at the Defense Department in the 40s and 50s. The reports had said the material was very lightweight and extremely strong. The creatures found in the crashed saucers were very light, and this might have been how they were able to withstand the extreme acceleration and the sudden maneuvers of the craft. The materials and the bodies recovered from crash sites were being stored at Wright-Patterson Air Base. UFO researcher Leonard Stringfield tells us there might have been a second Laredo UFO crash. This one is supposed to have taken place on June 19th, 1953. The story is very sketchy and the details are few. The craft is said to have come down in an unknown location. Major Daly was dispatched to the scene in order to give his opinion as to the craft's origins. The major was blindfolded to keep the location a secret from everyone except those who absolutely had to know. The major examined the craft and he said it was 25 to 30 feet across, made from some shiny silvery metal. The craft had a very small door built into the side. It looked too small for humans to use. Inside the craft were 4 bodies. They wore silvery suits that had become fused to the bodies in the fire from the crash. The suits were in relatively good shape, but the bodies were badly damaged. Some were nearly totally destroyed. The body that looked in the best shape was just under 5 feet tall. The head was large in relations to the body. The saucer and its inhabitants were packaged up and shipped to, where else? Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where General Twining was able to examine the recovered evidence. If you'd like to read more about the Laredo UFO crash, check out the book Fallen Angel by Noe Torres from Roswell Books or Amazon.com. Mr. Torres is a member of MUFON, and he's a field investigator as well. In 1955, Air Force pilot Robert Wilmingham was flying his F-86 fighter along the border with Mexico when a strange craft shot by him doing something around 2,000 miles an hour. He was amazed when the craft did a 90-degree turn without slowing down. Any human pilot would have been killed by the tremendous gravitational forces exerted on them by this turn. The World War II and Korean War pilot gave chase. This was nothing in the U.S. military, and he wanted to know who or what was piloting it. As he watched the craft suddenly begin to wobble, then it dropped down from the sky. It impacted the ground 200 miles northwest from Laredo on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande. The crash site was just across from Langtree, Texas, the former home of Judge Roy Bean. The craft was traveling fast enough to plow a 300-foot trench before coming to a rest up against the side of a hill. Being in an Air Force jet, he couldn't land or get anywhere near the crash site. The colonel returned to his base and jumped into a smaller, private-owned airplane so he could return to the crash site. He took a man named Perkins along to show him the downed saucer. Once they landed in the field near the crash site, they found the Mexican army had cordoned off the area and they wouldn't allow anybody, including these two, anywhere near the saucer. They did get to look at the thing, but only from a distance. The debris from the saucer was scattered across a large area. Colonel Willingham found a small piece of the craft lying in the sand, and he pocketed it without the soldiers seeing him. Later, the colonel tried to cut the piece of metal with a cutting torch, with no results. He believes it is not from this earth. If you want to read some more about this crash, check out The Other Roswell by Noe Torres and Ruben Uriarte. You can find it at Roswell Books or, once again, Amazon. I came across a report that said there was a UFO recovered near Laredo that took place in October 23, 1972. As I read the report, it became glaringly obvious this report was the 1948 crash south of Laredo and the Coyame, Mexico plane flying saucer crash from August 25, 1974 in the state of Chihuahua. These two crashes had been scrambled together to form one story. The time was changed to 1972, but the story was all but a match in every detail to the two previous accidents. It made for some exciting reading, but the story is just a mashup of two other crashes. Now, the story about the Laredo UFO crash was all but lost to history. Sometime around 2010, the Laredo incident became big news once more. People began to talk about what had happened, and this led to more questions than answers. 2011, the Webb County Heritage Foundation held the very first UFO conference here in Laredo. The keynote speaker was Travis Walton, the Snowflake, Arizona alien abductee. His book, Fire in the Sky, tells about his close encounter of the worst kind when he vanished from the woods, only to reemerge 5 days later in Haber, Arizona. And it was made into a movie by the same name. Each year, in December, we put up our Christmas tree. I get the first ornament out from its box and I place it on the tree. The ornament is a small flying saucer with Travis Walton's signature on it. He signed it November 5th, 2011, 36 years to the hour from when he was abducted in November 5th, 1975. Travis Walton will be appearing at the Out of This World UFO Conference, October 14th, 2018, in Edinburgh, Texas, if you want to bring your own little ornament and hopefully get him to sign it. Nick Pope from the British Ministry of Defense will be there, as well as John Greenwald, the founder of the Black Vault, and of course Noe Torres will be there as well. Now, I did write a book based on the Laredo UFO Crash. Mine is a work of fiction. It takes place in 1943. The Laredo Army Airfield is under attack from aliens from outer space. I used the same Laredo Crash story to give my book a little bit of a twist. I also try to make this sci-fi story as interesting as possible. Aliens, flying saucers, robots, it has it all. And check out Saucers by Chris James if you'd like to give it a read. But remember, this is a work of fiction. If you enjoyed tonight's show, you can find our archives at strangethings.podomatic.com, and they're free. If you have a story you'd like to pass on, you can contact us at strangethings@arcanasa.com. And if you're a Facebook fan, you can join us at Strange Things with Chris James. Till next Saturday, this is your host saying so long and hope you've enjoyed the show.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?